Bear cub trapped on a floating ice skating stage and took it to hospital. What this baby did was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The frozen lake stretched like a mirror under the pale winter sky, its surface broken only by a single floating platform that served as the town's temporary ice skating rink. The wooden structure bobbed gently in the center of the lake, connected to shore by a narrow bridge that creaked with every gust of wind. 19-month-old Raven sat by her bedroom window, pressing her tiny palms against the cold glass. Her breath fogged the window as she watched the empty skating platform sway in the distance. Something about the lonely structure fascinated her, though she couldn't understand why her parents always seemed worried when they looked toward the lake. "Raven, come away from the window, sweetheart," her mother Celeste called from the kitchen. "The lake makes me nervous when it's this cold." But Raven remained transfixed. Her young eyes, still learning to focus on distant objects, caught movement near the platform. A small, dark shape moved across the white expanse, stumbling and sliding on the ice. The bear cub had wandered far from its den, following a scent that led it toward the strange floating structure. At only 4 months old, the cub moved with the awkward uncertainty of youth, its paws slipping on the smooth ice as it approached the platform's edge. Raven pressed her face closer to the window. The dark shape was moving strangely, almost dancing on the white surface. She made a soft cooing sound, the kind she usually reserved for her favorite stuffed animals. The cub, driven by curiosity and the lingering scent of fish that the skating rink's maintenance crew had used to clean the platform earlier, climbed onto the wooden structure. The platform dipped slightly under the unexpected weight, sending small waves across the partially frozen water beneath. As the cub explored the unfamiliar surface, its paw caught in a loose section of safety netting that hung along the platform's edge. The netting, designed to prevent skaters from falling into the water, had become tangled and torn from recent winter storms. Raven watched as the dark shape suddenly stopped moving smoothly. Now it seemed to be struggling, twisting in an unnatural way. She pressed both hands against the window and made a sound her parents had never heard before, a low, worried whimper that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. The cub's frightened cries echoed across the frozen lake, but the sound was carried away by the wind before it could reach the scattered houses along the shore. Each movement the young bear made only tightened the netting around its leg, and panic began to set in. Raven's breathing quickened against the window glass. She couldn't understand what she was seeing, but every instinct in her young body told her that something was terribly wrong. She turned from the window and looked toward the kitchen where her mother was preparing dinner. "Mama," she called in her small voice, though the word came out more like "mama, ma" in the way of toddlers. Celeste didn't hear her daughter's call over the sound of running water and clattering dishes. She was lost in her own thoughts, worried about her husband Xavier, who was working late at the hospital again. Raven turned back to the window. The dark shape was moving more frantically now, and even from this distance she could sense its distress. Something deep in her young mind, some primal understanding that connected all living creatures, told her that the thing on the platform needed help. She looked down at her feet, still unsteady after learning to walk just 3 months ago. Then she looked at the door to her room, which her parents always left slightly open so they could hear if she needed anything. The cub's struggles were becoming weaker as exhaustion set in. The netting had cut off circulation to its hind leg, and the cold was beginning to seep through its thick fur. Its mother was miles away, foraging in a different part of the forest, unaware that her baby had wandered so far from safety. Raven made a decision that would have seemed impossible for someone her age. She walked to her bedroom door with the determined steps of a child who had suddenly found purpose. Her small hand reached for the doorknob, though she had to stretch to reach it. The house was quiet except for the sounds coming from the kitchen. Raven's father wouldn't be home for hours, and her mother was focused on her evening routine. No one saw the tiny figure slip out of the bedroom and begin making her way toward the front door. As Raven moved through the hallway, the cub on the platform let out another cry, this one weaker than the last. The sound somehow reached through the walls and windows, touching something in the toddler's heart that made her move faster despite her unsteady legs. She reached the front door and stared up at the handle, far above her reach. But Raven had learned to solve problems in the way that only very young children can, with pure determination and creative thinking that adults often lose. She dragged a small stool from the nearby bathroom, the legs scraping softly against the hardwood floor. Standing on the stool, she could just reach the door handle, though turning it required all her strength. The cold air hit her face as the door opened, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else. Something wild and afraid that made her young heart beat faster. She looked toward the lake, where the floating platform seemed both impossibly far away and somehow calling to her. Without hesitation, Raven stepped out into the winter night, her small feet touching the cold porch boards. She was wearing only her pajamas and socks, but the urgency she felt pushed away any awareness of the temperature. Behind her, the house remained warm and bright, her mother still unaware that her 19-month-old daughter had just embarked on what would become the most extraordinary night of both their lives. The snow crunched under Raven's tiny feet as she stepped off the porch. Each step left a perfect small footprint in the fresh powder, creating a trail that would later tell a story no one would believe. The cold bit through her thin pajamas, but something inside her pushed away the discomfort. Her young mind was focused entirely on the dark shape she had seen struggling on the distant platform. She walked toward the lake with the single-minded determination that only small children possess. Her breath came out in small puffs of white vapor, and her cheeks quickly turned pink from the cold air. The moon above cast everything in a silver glow that made the snow sparkle like tiny diamonds scattered across the ground. As Raven moved closer to the water's edge, she began to hear something that made her stop. A sound unlike anything she had ever heard before reached her ears. A low, mournful crying that seemed to come from the floating platform. The cub's distress calls carried across the frozen lake, and somehow, impossibly, the 19-month-old understood exactly what they meant. The cub on the platform had grown weaker with each passing minute. The netting around its leg had tightened to the point where the young bear could barely feel its paw. Its struggles had become feeble, more like gentle movements than the frantic thrashing from before. Ice crystals were forming on its fur where its breath had frozen in the cold air. But as Raven's small figure appeared at the edge of the lake, something extraordinary happened. The cub lifted its head and looked directly at her. Across the distance that separated them, two young creatures made eye contact, and in that moment, an impossible connection was formed. Raven raised her small hand and waved at the cub. She didn't understand why, but it felt like the right thing to do. To her amazement, the cub responded with a soft whimpering sound that was different from its earlier cries. This sound was almost like an answer. "Hi," Raven whispered into the cold air, her voice so quiet it should have been swallowed by the wind. But somehow, across the frozen expanse, the cub heard her. It tried to move toward the sound of her voice, but the netting held it firmly in place. Raven looked at the narrow bridge that connected the platform to the shore. The wooden walkway swayed slightly in the wind, and even from her position, she could see that several boards were missing or broken. It looked dangerous, but her young mind didn't process danger the way an adult's would. She only saw a path to the creature that needed her help. As she took her first step onto the bridge, the old wood creaked loudly under even her tiny weight. The sound echoed across the lake, and for a moment the cub stopped its soft whimpering to listen. Raven took another step, then another, her small hands gripping the rope railings that ran along both sides of the walkway. The bridge swayed more with each step she took. Below her, the partially frozen water lapped against the support posts with soft splashing sounds. Raven looked down once and saw her reflection in the dark water between chunks of ice. The sight should have frightened her, but instead, it only made her more determined to reach the platform. Halfway across the bridge, one of the boards shifted under her foot. For a terrifying moment, Raven felt herself losing balance. Her small hands gripped the rope railing tighter, and she managed to steady herself, but the incident sent a loud cracking sound across the lake. Inside the house, Celeste paused in her dishwashing. She thought she had heard something unusual, but when she listened more carefully, she only heard the normal sounds of wind and settling wood that came with winter nights. She glanced toward Raven's room and saw that the door was still slightly open, just as she had left it. "Raven, sweetie, are you okay?" she called softly. When no answer came, Celeste assumed her daughter had fallen asleep. She dried her hands and continued with her evening routine, completely unaware that her child was at that very moment making her way across a dangerous bridge in nothing but pajamas and socks. On the platform, the cub had heard the cracking sound and lifted its head again. Through its pain and exhaustion, it sensed that the small figure was coming closer. Something in its young animal mind recognized that this tiny human was different from the adults it had learned to fear. This one was small, like itself, vulnerable, like itself, and somehow, impossibly, trying to help. Raven reached the end of the bridge and stepped onto the floating platform. The wooden structure dipped slightly under her weight, sending small ripples through the water beneath. She was now only a few feet away from the trapped cub, and for the first time she could see clearly what was wrong. The young bear was smaller than she had expected, not much bigger than her favorite teddy bear at home. Its dark fur was matted with ice, and one of its back legs was tangled in what looked like rope. The cub's eyes were wide with fear and pain, but when it saw Raven approaching, something in its expression changed. "Oh no," Raven whispered, her young voice filled with concern that seemed far beyond her years. She knelt down on the cold platform, bringing herself to the cub's eye level. "You're stuck." The cub made a soft sound, almost like a whimper, but gentler than its earlier cries. It was looking directly at Raven, and in its dark eyes she saw something that reminded her of herself when she had fallen and scraped her knee the week before. It was hurt, it was scared, and it needed someone to help make things better. Raven reached out her small hand toward the cub, moving slowly the way her father had taught her to approach their neighbor's cat. But as her fingers got closer to the tangled netting, something unexpected happened that would change everything. The cub, instead of pulling away or showing fear, stretched its nose toward Raven's outstretched hand. The moment their skin and fur touched, both young creatures felt something that neither could understand, but both recognized. A connection that went deeper than species, deeper than the fear that should have existed between human and wild animal. In that instant, Raven felt the cub's pain as if it were her own. The sensation was so strong that tears began to form in her young eyes. But along with the pain, she felt something else. The cub's trust. Somehow, this wild animal was trusting her completely, and that trust filled her with a courage she had never felt before. "I'm going to help you," she whispered, her small hands moving toward the tangled netting. "Don't be scared." But as Raven began to work at the ropes that held the cub prisoner, neither of them noticed the dark shape that had emerged from the forest on the far shore. A much larger bear had caught the scent of her cub on the wind and was now standing at the edge of the tree line, her massive form silhouetted against the snow. The mother bear had been searching for her missing baby for hours. Her powerful nose had led her to the lake, and now she could see the floating platform where her cub was trapped. But she could also see something that filled her with a protective rage that threatened to override all other instincts. A human was touching her baby. The mother bear stepped onto the ice, her enormous weight causing the frozen surface to crack and groan beneath her paws. She was moving toward the platform with the deadly purpose of a mother defending her young, and she would be there in less than 2 minutes. On the platform, Raven continued working at the netting, completely unaware of the approaching danger. Her small fingers were numb from the cold, but she kept trying to loosen the ropes that held the cub's leg. The young bear remained perfectly still, as if it understood that this tiny human was its only hope. "Almost got it," Raven murmured, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. She had managed to loosen one section of the netting, but the main tangle was proving too difficult for her small hands to manage. The cub made a soft sound that almost sounded like encouragement, and Raven looked into its eyes again. In that moment, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible for someone her age. She knew she couldn't untangle the netting, but she had another idea. Instead of continuing to work at the ropes, Raven lay down on the platform next to the cub and wrapped her small arms around its furry body. The young bear should have panicked at being held by a human, but instead it relaxed into her embrace, as if it had been waiting its entire short life for exactly this moment. "We're going to be okay," Raven whispered into the cub's fur, though she had no idea how prophetic her words would prove to be. "I won't leave you alone." The mother bear was now halfway across the lake, her massive form moving with surprising speed across the ice. Each step brought her closer to what she perceived as a threat to her cub, and the sound of her approach was beginning to carry across the frozen water like distant thunder. But something extraordinary was happening on the platform that would soon change the course of this winter night in ways no one could have predicted. As Raven held the frightened cub, both young creatures began to feel something neither had ever experienced before, a sense of family that had nothing to do with blood or species, and everything to do with the pure, uncomplicated love that exists in the hearts of the very young. The mother bear's thunderous approach across the ice suddenly stopped. She had reached a point where she could see the platform clearly, and what she witnessed made her freeze in confusion. Instead of seeing her cub being threatened by a human, she saw something that challenged every instinct she possessed. A tiny human child was lying on the cold wooden platform, holding her baby gently, protectively, as if it were her own. The massive bear tilted her head, studying the scene with the intelligence that made her species such successful survivors. Her cub wasn't struggling or crying in fear. Instead, it was nestled against the small human, making soft contentment sounds she had only heard when it was safe in their den. The sight was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she knew about humans, that her aggressive posture began to relax. On the platform, Raven was experiencing something that would stay with her for the rest of her life, though she would never find words to describe it. As she held the cub, she began to feel its heartbeat against her chest. The rhythm was faster than her own, quick with fear and pain, but as the minutes passed, it began to slow and match her calmer pulse. "Your mama is coming," Raven whispered into the cub's ear, though she had no way of knowing this was true. "She'll be so happy to see you." The cub made a small sound that vibrated through its chest, and Raven felt it like a purr. She had never experienced anything like this connection before. It was as if she could understand what the young bear was trying to tell her, even though it spoke no words. The mother bear took another cautious step closer, the ice creaking under her massive weight. She was now close enough to hear the soft sounds coming from the platform, her cub's gentle murmurs and the whispered words of the tiny human. Nothing about this situation made sense to her, but one thing was becoming clear: her baby was not in danger. Back at the house, Celeste had finished cleaning the kitchen and was settling into her favorite chair with a cup of tea. She glanced at the clock and saw that it was past Raven's usual bedtime, but she decided to let her daughter sleep a little longer. The long winter days had been hard on both of them, with Xavier working such long hours at the hospital. She picked up a book and was about to start reading when a sound from outside made her pause. It was faint, but it sounded almost like voices carrying on the wind. She listened more carefully, but when the sound didn't repeat, she convinced herself it had been her imagination. On the platform, Raven was discovering that holding the cub was helping to keep both of them warm. The young bear's body heat, combined with its thick fur, created a small pocket of warmth around them both. Her initial shivering had stopped, and she felt surprisingly comfortable, despite being outside in her pajamas. "We need to get you free," she told the cub, gently running her small hand along its fur. "But I don't know how." As if responding to her words, the cub shifted slightly and looked toward its trapped leg. Raven followed its gaze and saw something she had missed before, in the dim light. The netting wasn't just tangled around the cub's paw, it was also caught on a loose nail that stuck out from one of the platform's boards. Moving carefully so she wouldn't frighten the cub, Raven repositioned herself to get a better look at the problem. The nail was rusty and bent, and the netting had wrapped around it several times, but as she examined it more closely, she realized something that filled her with hope. The nail wasn't driven deep into the wood, it was loose, wiggling slightly when the platform swayed. "I think I can fix this," she whispered to the cub, and again she felt that strange sensation of being understood, even though she was talking to an animal that couldn't possibly comprehend her words. The mother bear had moved closer still, and she was now at the edge where the platform's support cables met the shore. She could see everything clearly now: her cub lying peacefully with the tiny human, the tangled netting, and most surprisingly the gentle way the child was touching her baby. Every protective instinct told her to charge onto the platform and rescue her cub, but something deeper, some ancient wisdom about the intentions of the very young, held her back. Raven began working at the loose nail with her small fingers. The metal was cold and rough against her skin, but she kept trying to wiggle it free. Each movement caused the platform to sway slightly, and she had to pause frequently to keep her balance. The cub seemed to understand what she was trying to do and held perfectly still, as if it knew that any sudden movement might send them both into the icy water below. After several minutes of careful work, Raven felt the nail beginning to give way. It was moving more freely now, and she could see that if she could just pull it out completely, the netting would come loose and the cub would be free. But the nail was still partially stuck, and her small hands were getting numb from the cold. Just as she was beginning to think the task might be impossible, something remarkable happened. The cub, which had been lying quietly beside her, suddenly moved its head closer to where she was working. It opened its small mouth and gently took hold of a section of the netting in its teeth. "Oh, you want to help," Raven exclaimed softly, and she swore she saw something like understanding in the cub's dark eyes. Working together in a way that should have been impossible between a human child and a wild animal, they began to coordinate their efforts. Raven pulled at the nail while the cub carefully tugged at the netting from a different angle. It was slow work, and several times they had to stop and rest, but gradually they began to make progress. The mother bear watched this unprecedented cooperation with growing amazement. She had never seen anything like it in all her years in the wild. Her cub, who had never encountered a human before tonight, was working with this tiny child as if they had known each other their entire lives. Finally, after what felt like hours but had probably been only minutes, Raven felt the nail pull free from the wood. The sudden release caught her by surprise, and she fell backward on the platform, the rusty nail still clutched in her small fist. The netting, freed from its anchor point, immediately loosened around the cub's leg. The young bear pulled its paw free and immediately began licking the area where the netting had cut into its fur. There was no serious injury, just some matted hair and a few minor scrapes, but the relief of being free was obvious in every movement it made. Raven sat up on the platform, still holding the nail that had caused all the trouble. She looked at the cub, which was now standing and testing its freed leg, and felt a surge of happiness unlike anything she had ever experienced. "You're okay," she said, clapping her small hands together in delight. "You're really okay." The cub turned to look at her, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Then, in a gesture that would have seemed impossible to anyone who witnessed it, the young bear stepped closer to Raven and gently nuzzled her cheek with its cold, wet nose. The sensation of the cub's touch sent shivers through Raven that had nothing to do with the cold. She reached up and gently stroked the side of its face, marveling at how soft its fur was and how trust shone in its eyes. "I wish you could come home with me," she whispered, and the sadness in her voice was genuine. In the short time they had spent together, she had formed an attachment to this wild creature that felt as real and strong as her love for her parents. The cub seemed to sense her sadness and made a soft sound that was almost like a sigh. It pressed closer to her, as if it too was reluctant to end this magical connection they had discovered. But their moment of peace was about to be interrupted in a way that would test the bond they had formed. The mother bear, seeing that her cub was now free and apparently unharmed, began to move onto the platform itself. The wooden structure, which had barely supported Raven and the cub, groaned ominously under the weight of the massive adult bear. The sound of cracking wood filled the air, and suddenly the platform tilted dramatically to one side. Raven, who had been sitting comfortably just moments before, found herself sliding toward the edge where the dark water waited below. She reached out desperately for something to hold on to, but her small hands found nothing but smooth, wet wood. The cub, seeing its new friend in danger, reacted with an instinct that surprised even its mother. Instead of running toward the safety of the approaching adult bear, it lunged toward Raven, catching the fabric of her pajama sleeve in its small teeth just as she was about to slide into the water. For a terrifying moment, both young creatures hung at the edge of the tilting platform. The cub's grip on Raven's sleeve the only thing preventing her from falling into the icy lake. The mother bear, realizing that her approach had created this dangerous situation, froze in place, afraid that any further movement would send the platform completely underwater. The weight of both the cub and Raven hanging from the platform's edge was too much for the young bear to support for long. Its small teeth were losing their grip on the fabric, and Raven could feel herself beginning to slip again. Below them, the dark water looked impossibly deep and frighteningly cold. Just when it seemed that both children would fall into the lake, something extraordinary happened that would become the turning point of this incredible night. From somewhere in the darkness beyond the platform, a new voice called out across the frozen water. "Raven! Oh my God, Raven!" It was Celeste, who had finally discovered her daughter's empty bedroom and had followed the small footprints in the snow to the lake's edge. She was standing on the shore, still in her house slippers and robe, staring in horror at the scene unfolding on the tilting platform. But Celeste wasn't alone. Behind her, drawn by her screams of terror, came the headlights of a vehicle racing down the lakeside road. Xavier had just returned from his shift at the hospital, and he had heard his wife's cries from 2 blocks away. The sound of human voices seemed to galvanize the mother bear into action. She realized that more humans were coming, and her protective instincts for her cub finally overrode her caution about the unstable platform. She moved quickly but carefully toward where the 2 young ones hung in danger, her massive size causing the platform to tilt even further, but also allowing her to reach them. With a gentleness that seemed impossible for such a large and powerful creature, she used her enormous paw to carefully push both Raven and her cub back onto the stable part of the platform. The motion was so precise and deliberate that it was clear she understood exactly what needed to be done. Once both youngsters were safe, the mother bear looked directly at Raven for the first time. Their eyes met across the few feet that separated them, and in that moment, an understanding passed between them that transcended species. The bear saw in Raven's eyes the same love for her cub that she herself felt, and Raven saw in the bear's gaze a gratitude that was unmistakably maternal. From the shore, Celeste and Xavier watched in stunned silence as this impossible scene unfolded. They had arrived expecting to rescue their daughter from a dangerous situation, but instead they were witnessing something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the relationship between humans and wild animals. Xavier, despite his medical training and scientific background, found himself struggling to process what he was seeing. His 19-month-old daughter was sitting calmly on a floating platform with 2 wild bears, and none of them appeared to be afraid of the others. The massive mother bear, who should have been the most dangerous creature in this scenario, was behaving more like a protective guardian than a threat. "Xavier, what do we do?" Celeste whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and amazement. "I don't understand what's happening out there." Before Xavier could answer, something even more extraordinary occurred. The cub, now free from the netting but still on the unstable platform, began to make soft sounds toward its mother. But instead of the usual communication between bears, these sounds seemed almost like it was trying to introduce Raven to its parent. The mother bear responded with gentle rumbling noises, and then she did something that made both human parents gasp in disbelief. She lowered her massive head toward Raven and very carefully, very gently, sniffed the tiny human child. Raven, showing no fear whatsoever, reached up and placed her small hand on the bear's enormous snout. The contrast was startling. Her tiny palm barely covered a fraction of the bear's nose, yet the powerful creature remained perfectly still, allowing the touch as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Mama Bear," Raven said softly, her young voice carrying across the water with perfect clarity. "You found your baby." At those words, something shifted in the air around the lake. Even from the shore, Celeste and Xavier could sense that they were witnessing a moment that would change all of their lives forever. Their daughter wasn't just interacting with wild animals, she was communicating with them in a way that seemed to transcend normal human understanding. The mother bear made a low sound in response to Raven's words, a rumble so deep and gentle that it seemed like approval, even gratitude. She then carefully positioned herself so that the platform became more stable, using her weight to balance the wooden structure that had been tilting dangerously just moments before. Xavier realized that he needed to act, but every instinct told him that approaching too quickly or making sudden movements might shatter whatever delicate piece existed on that platform. As a doctor, he had learned to read situations carefully before intervening, and this situation required more care than any emergency he had ever encountered. "Raven, sweetheart," he called out gently, his voice carrying the same calm tone he used with frightened patients. "Daddy's here. Can you hear me?" Raven turned toward the sound of her father's voice, and her face lit up with the kind of pure joy that only small children can express. But instead of trying to leave the platform immediately, she looked back at the cub and then at its mother, as if she was torn between her human family and these new friends she had made. "Daddy, look," she called back, pointing at the cub. "Baby bear was stuck, but we fixed it, and Mama Bear came to help." The simplicity of her explanation, delivered with the matter-of-fact tone that children use to describe the most extraordinary events, made the situation seem almost normal. But Xavier knew there was nothing normal about what was happening here. As if sensing the need to resolve this standoff, the mother bear began to make a decision that would surprise everyone present. Instead of taking her cub and disappearing back into the forest, she started to carefully move toward the edge of the platform closest to the shore, encouraging her baby to follow. The cub, however, seemed reluctant to leave Raven. It kept looking back at the tiny human who had saved it, making soft whimpering sounds that clearly expressed its confusion about having to say goodbye to its new friend. Raven understood the cub's distress because she felt the same way. In the short time they had spent together, a bond had formed that felt as real to her as any relationship in her young life. The thought of never seeing the cub again made her eyes fill with tears. "You have to go with your mama," she told the cub, her small voice heavy with sadness. "But I'll never forget you." What happened next would become a story that the family would tell for generations, though many people would never believe it actually occurred. The cub walked back to Raven one more time and gently pressed its head against her chest, right over her heart. The gesture was so deliberate, so full of meaning, that everyone watching understood they were witnessing something that went far beyond normal animal behavior. Raven wrapped her arms around the cub's neck one last time, holding it close and whispering words that only it could hear. When they finally separated, both young creatures looked at each other with eyes that seemed to hold a promise that somehow, someday, they would meet again. The mother bear, who had been watching this farewell with what could only be described as patience and understanding, finally approached her cub and began to guide it toward the shore. But as they prepared to leave the platform, she did something that no one expected. She walked back to where Raven was sitting and, with incredible gentleness, picked up something in her mouth. It was the rusty nail that had trapped her cub, the one that Raven had worked so hard to remove. The mother bear carried it to the edge of the platform and dropped it into the water, where it sank immediately into the dark depths. The symbolism of the gesture was not lost on any of the humans watching. The bear was disposing of the thing that had caused her cub's suffering, and she was doing it in a way that seemed almost ceremonial, as if she understood that this night marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of something new. With the nail gone, the mother bear and her cub finally began to make their way toward shore. The platform, relieved of their combined weight, stopped swaying and became stable again. But instead of swimming or walking along the ice, the bears did something that added yet another layer of mystery to this already impossible night. They began to move in single file along a path that none of the humans had noticed before. A narrow strip of ice that seemed to have formed naturally between the platform and the shore, creating a bridge that was just wide enough for them to walk safely to land. Xavier stared at this ice bridge in bewilderment. He had lived by this lake his entire life, and he had never seen ice form in such a precise, convenient pattern. The strip looked almost like it had been deliberately created to provide safe passage, though he knew that was impossible. As the bears reached the shore, they paused at the water's edge and looked back toward the platform where Raven still sat. The mother bear made one final sound, a low call that echoed across the lake like a farewell song. Then, with her cub beside her, she turned and began to walk toward the forest. But they didn't disappear immediately. Instead, they stopped at the edge of the tree line and remained there, two dark silhouettes against the snow, as if they were waiting for something. On the platform, Raven stood up on unsteady legs and waved at her departing friends. "Bye, Mama Bear, bye, Baby Bear," she called, her voice carrying across the water with surprising strength for such a small child. The bears seemed to respond to her farewell. The cub stood up on its hind legs briefly, a gesture that looked remarkably like a return wave, before dropping back down and following its mother into the darkness of the forest. Only after the bears had completely disappeared did Xavier feel it was safe to approach the platform. But now he faced a new problem: how to get his daughter back to shore safely. The ice bridge that the bears had used was already beginning to crack and break apart, as if it had served its purpose and was no longer needed. "Raven, stay right where you are," Xavier called out as he began to remove his coat and boots. "Daddy's coming to get you." But before he could enter the water, Celeste grabbed his arm. "Xavier, the water's too cold. You'll never make it in these conditions." She was right, and Xavier knew it. The lake was partially frozen, but the water beneath was still liquid and cold enough to cause hypothermia within minutes. Swimming to the platform and back while carrying a toddler would be extremely dangerous, if not impossible. As they stood on the shore trying to figure out how to rescue their daughter, Raven made an announcement that surprised them both. "I can walk back," she said, pointing toward the bridge she had used to reach the platform. "The bridge is still there." Xavier looked at the narrow wooden walkway and felt his heart sink. Even in daylight, that bridge would be dangerous for a small child. In the darkness, with several boards missing and the structure swaying in the wind, it looked like a death trap. But as he studied the bridge more carefully, Xavier noticed something strange. The boards that had been missing when Raven first crossed were somehow back in place. The gaps that should have made the walkway impassable were now filled with wood that looked old and weathered, as if it had always been there. "That's impossible," he muttered to himself, but even as he said it, he was walking toward the bridge to examine it more closely. The walkway was indeed complete now, though Xavier could have sworn he had seen missing planks earlier. More importantly, the entire structure seemed more stable than before, as if it had been reinforced by some invisible hand. Celeste joined him at the bridge's entrance, and she too stared in amazement at what appeared to be a complete repair job that had been accomplished in mere minutes, with no workers, no tools, and no explanation. "Raven," Xavier called out, "can you walk back across by yourself? Hold on to the ropes on both sides and take your time." From the platform, Raven nodded confidently. "The bears showed me how," she said, as if this explanation made perfect sense. What she meant by that comment none of them would ever fully understand, but as Raven began to make her way back across the bridge, her movements were sure and steady, in a way that seemed impossible for a 19-month-old child who had only learned to walk a few months earlier. She crossed the bridge with the confidence of someone much older, her small hands gripping the rope railings exactly as they should, her feet finding the center of each board with precision that suggested she had made this journey many times before. When she reached the shore and fell into her parents' arms, the first thing she said was not about her own adventure, but about her new friends. "Mama Bear and Baby Bear are going to be okay now," she announced with complete certainty. "They told me they have a safe place to sleep." Xavier and Celeste exchanged glances over their daughter's head. They were both wondering the same thing. How could their barely verbal toddler claim to have had conversations with wild bears? But as they wrapped Raven in Xavier's warm coat and began to walk back toward their house, something made them all turn around for one final look at the lake. There, on the floating platform they had just left, sat a small pile of items that definitely hadn't been there before. Even from this distance, they could see that someone, or something, had left a collection of objects on the wooden structure. Xavier squinted in the moonlight and could make out what appeared to be fish, berries, and other natural items arranged in a neat circle. "It's a thank you present," Raven said matter-of-factly, as if she had been expecting this gift all along. Mama Bear wanted to say thank you for helping her baby. The family stood in silence for a long moment, staring at the impossible offering that had been left for them on the platform. None of them would ever be able to explain how those items had appeared there, or how Raven seemed to know exactly what they meant. As they finally turned to head home, Xavier found himself wondering if this night had actually happened, or if he was experiencing the most vivid dream of his life. But the weight of his daughter in his arms, the cold air on his face, and the unmistakable smell of wild animals that clung to Raven's pajamas told him that everything he had witnessed was absolutely real. What none of them realized as they walked away from the lake was that this was only the beginning of a story that would continue to unfold in ways they never could have imagined. The connection that had been formed between Raven and the Bear family would prove to be stronger and more lasting than any of them suspected. And high up in a tree at the edge of the forest, two pairs of dark eyes watched the human family make their way home, making sure they arrived safely before disappearing into the wilderness to begin their own new chapter. The walk back to the house was eerily quiet, broken only by the soft crunch of snow under their feet and Raven's occasional murmurs about her bear friends. Xavier carried his daughter, who seemed completely unaffected by the cold, despite having spent nearly an hour outside in nothing but thin pajamas. Her body temperature felt normal, her breathing was steady, and she showed no signs of the hypothermia or frostbite that should have been inevitable after such exposure. Celeste walked beside them, her mind racing with questions she couldn't begin to answer. Every few steps she would glance back toward the lake, half expecting to see the bears following them, or to discover that the entire experience had been some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by winter cabin fever. But the evidence was undeniable. Raven's pajamas carried the distinct musky scent of wild animals, and there were small tufts of brown fur clinging to the fabric where she had embraced the cub. More puzzling still were the tiny scratches on her hands, not deep enough to be dangerous, but clearly made by something with claws, something wild. As they reached their front door, Xavier set Raven down so he could search for his keys. The moment her feet touched the porch, something extraordinary happened that made both parents freeze in amazement. Every outdoor light in their yard, lights that had been dark when they left the house, suddenly flickered on simultaneously. The porch light, the garden lights, even the decorative solar lights that lined their walkway all began to glow with a warm, welcoming radiance that seemed to pulse gently like a heartbeat. "The power was out earlier," Celeste whispered to Xavier. "I remember checking the breaker box when the kitchen lights went off." Xavier stared at the impossible display of illumination surrounding their home. He was certain the power had been out in this section of the neighborhood for hours, which was why he had been working by flashlight when he received Celeste's frantic phone call about Raven being missing. But there was no time to investigate this new mystery, because as soon as they stepped inside the house, they discovered that their night of impossible events was far from over. The living room, which Celeste had left neat and tidy, was now filled with the most beautiful arrangements of natural items she had ever seen. Pine cones, colorful leaves, smooth river stones, and branches arranged in intricate patterns covered every surface. The designs were too complex and artistic to have been created by any animal, yet no human had been in their house. "Mama, look," Raven exclaimed, pointing at the arrangements with delight. "They made our house pretty." Before either parent could respond, Raven walked over to the largest arrangement, which sat in the center of their coffee table. Hidden within the pattern of natural items was something that made Xavier's medical training kick into high alert. Several plants that he recognized as having powerful healing properties. There was willow bark, which contained natural compounds similar to aspirin. Wild ginger root that could settle upset stomachs. Echinacea flowers that boosted immune systems. Someone, or something, had not only decorated their home, but had left them a natural pharmacy of remedies. Celeste picked up one of the pine cones and examined it closely. It was perfect, with no damage or decay, as if it had been carefully selected from hundreds of others. As she turned it over in her hands, she noticed something that made her gasp. Carved into the base of the pine cone, so small that it was barely visible, was a tiny symbol that looked remarkably like a heart. She showed it to Xavier, who examined several other items and found similar markings. Small symbols of friendship and protection carved with impossible precision into natural materials. "Xavier, what is happening to us?" Celeste asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just about Raven and the bears anymore. Something else is going on here." Before Xavier could answer, Raven solved part of the mystery in the way that only small children can, with complete honesty and no awareness that what she was saying should be impossible. "The forest friends wanted to say thank you," she explained, settling into her favorite chair, as if this had been the most normal evening of her life. "Mama Bear told them about how I helped Baby Bear, and now they want to help us too." Xavier knelt down beside his daughter's chair, studying her face carefully. As a doctor, he was trained to recognize signs of trauma, confusion, or fabrication in patients, especially children. But Raven's expression showed none of those things. Her eyes were clear and bright, her manner calm and confident. She was telling what she believed to be the absolute truth. "Raven, sweetheart," he said gently, "how did Mama Bear tell the forest friends about you?" "Animals talk to each other all the time, Daddy," Raven replied, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow to understand. "You just have to know how to listen." As if to prove her point, a soft tapping sound came from their kitchen window. All three family members turned toward the sound and saw something that challenged their understanding of reality once again. A small red cardinal was perched on their windowsill, tapping its beak against the glass in a rhythmic pattern that sounded almost like Morse code. The bird was looking directly at Raven, and when she stood up and walked toward the window, it began to sing a series of notes that were unlike any bird song any of them had heard before. Raven pressed her face against the glass and made soft chirping sounds back at the cardinal. To Xavier and Celeste's amazement, the bird seemed to respond to their daughter's vocalizations, changing its song to match her rhythm and tone. "He says the Bear family made it home safely," Raven announced, turning back to her parents with a smile. "And Mama Bear wants us to know that if we ever need help, we should come to the old oak tree by Miller's Creek." Xavier felt his scientific worldview crumbling with each passing moment. Everything he had learned in medical school, everything he thought he knew about biology and animal behavior, was being challenged by his 19-month-old daughter's apparent ability to communicate with wildlife. The cardinal gave one final, elaborate song, and then flew away into the night, but almost immediately other animals began to appear at their windows. A raccoon family on the back porch, an owl on the roof whose calls could be heard through the ceiling, and even a fox that sat boldly in their front yard, all seemed to be checking on the family that had helped the bear cub. Celeste sat down heavily in her chair, overwhelmed by the parade of wildlife that had apparently decided their home was worthy of attention. "Xavier, I think we need to call someone about this. This isn't normal. None of this is normal." But before Xavier could respond, the most shocking development of the night occurred. The phone rang. In itself, a ringing phone wasn't unusual, but the timing felt significant given everything else that had happened. Xavier answered on the third ring, expecting to hear from a neighbor who might have seen the unusual activity around their house. Instead, he heard the voice of Dr. Patricia Fleming, the head of veterinary medicine at the Regional Wildlife Sanctuary, and someone he knew professionally from his work at the hospital. "Xavier, I'm sorry to call so late, but we've had the most extraordinary thing happen here tonight, and somehow your name came up in connection with it." Xavier felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of extraordinary thing, Patricia?" "Well, about an hour ago, a mother bear and her cub showed up at our sanctuary. Now, that's not unusual by itself, but Xavier, they weren't seeking help or food. They seemed to be delivering something." Xavier's grip tightened on the phone. "Delivering what?" "This is going to sound crazy, but they left a collection of medicinal plants at our front gate. Plants that we desperately needed for some injured animals we're treating. Plants that grow in very specific locations and would have taken our staff weeks to locate and harvest. It's like they knew exactly what we needed." Xavier looked across the room at the similar collection of healing plants that had mysteriously appeared in his own living room. "Patricia, did the bears do anything else? Any other unusual behavior?" "That's the strangest part, Xavier. Before they left, the mother bear did something I've never seen in 30 years of working with wildlife. She approached our main building and very deliberately placed her paw on our emergency contact list that's posted by the front door. Her paw print is still there, perfectly positioned over one name." Xavier already knew what she was going to say, but he asked anyway. "Whose name?" "Yours, Xavier. Her paw print is directly over your name and phone number. Almost like she was pointing at it, marking it somehow. Do you have any idea why a wild bear would do something like that?" Xavier looked at his daughter, who was now sitting on the floor, drawing pictures with crayons on a piece of paper. Her artwork showed what appeared to be a small girl and two bears holding hands under a large tree. At the bottom of the page, in the unsteady handwriting of a very young child, she had written what looked like letters that spelled FRENDS. "Patricia, I think I might have some idea," Xavier said slowly, "but you're going to think I'm crazy when I tell you." As Xavier began to explain the night's events to Dr. Fleming, Celeste noticed something else that made her question everything she thought she knew about her daughter. Raven had started to hum while she drew, and the melody she was humming was hauntingly beautiful, far more complex than any song a toddler should be able to remember or reproduce. But more importantly, the tune was identical to the song the Cardinal had been singing at their window just minutes before. Celeste listened carefully, and she realized that Raven wasn't just humming randomly. She was humming in response to sounds coming from outside. The calls of the owl on their roof, the chittering of the raccoons on their porch, the distant howl of what sounded like a wolf far in the forest. Her daughter was having a musical conversation with the wildlife surrounding their home, and somehow, impossibly, they were all responding to her. As Xavier continued his phone conversation with Dr. Fleming, Celeste made a decision that would prove to be crucial to understanding what was happening to their family. She quietly picked up her own phone and began to record everything. The sounds from outside, Raven's humming, and the way the animals seemed to be communicating with their daughter. What she captured in that recording would later be analyzed by wildlife experts, musicologists, and even scientists who studied animal communication. But none of them would ever be able to explain how a 19-month-old human child had learned to speak in the complex musical language that some of the world's most intelligent animals used to communicate across vast distances. When Xavier finally ended his call with Dr. Fleming, he found Celeste and Raven sitting together on the couch, listening to the symphony of animal sounds that surrounded their house. The cacophony should have been frightening or at least annoying, but instead it was strangely soothing, like a lullaby sung by the forest itself. "Dr. Fleming wants to meet with us tomorrow," Xavier announced. "She thinks Raven might be able to help them with some of their animal rehabilitation work. She's never seen anything like what happened at the sanctuary tonight." Celeste looked at her daughter, who was now fast asleep despite all the activity around them. Even in sleep, Raven was smiling, and she was making soft sounds that seemed to blend perfectly with the animal calls coming from outside. "Xavier, I think our daughter is different," Celeste said quietly. "This isn't just about one night with some bears. This is about something much bigger." Xavier nodded, settling into his chair and watching his sleeping daughter with new eyes. "I think you're right. And I think we're going to need to learn a whole new way of understanding the world if we're going to help her navigate whatever gift she's been given." As if responding to their conversation, the animal sounds outside began to fade gradually, like a chorus winding down at the end of a performance. One by one, the creatures that had gathered around their home began to disperse, until finally the night was quiet again. But the silence wasn't empty. It was full of promise, full of potential, full of the sense that this family's life had been forever changed by the events of this extraordinary night. Just before Xavier and Celeste went to bed, they made one final discovery that would haunt their dreams and shape their understanding of their daughter's future. On Raven's bedroom windowsill, they found a single item that hadn't been there when they put her to bed hours earlier. It was a small stone, perfectly smooth and round, with natural markings that looked remarkably like a map. Xavier studied it closely and realized that the lines and dots on the stone seemed to correspond to the geography around their lake. The forest paths, the creek, and most importantly, the location of the old oak tree that Raven had mentioned. Somehow, the animals had left their daughter a guide to their world, a map that would help her find her way back to them whenever she needed to. As they tucked the stone safely into Raven's jewelry box, both parents understood that this was just the beginning of an adventure that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between human and animal, between the civilized world and the wild, between what was possible and what was impossible. The next morning brought with it a series of discoveries that would forever change how the family viewed their quiet lakeside community. Xavier woke early, as was his habit before hospital shifts, but instead of the usual silence that greeted dawn in their neighborhood, he heard something that made him question whether he was still dreaming. Outside their bedroom window, a chorus of birds was singing in perfect harmony. Not the random chirping and calling that typically marked the beginning of day, but an organized, melodic composition that sounded almost like a symphony. Xavier counted at least 12 different species contributing to the music, their voices blending in ways that should have been impossible without extensive training. He slipped out of bed quietly, trying not to wake Celeste, and made his way to the living room window. What he saw in their backyard defied every assumption he had ever made about wildlife behavior. At least 30 animals were gathered in a perfect circle on their lawn. Rabbits sat next to foxes without any sign of fear or aggression. A family of deer grazed peacefully beside a coyote that should have seen them as prey. Raccoons, squirrels, chipmunks, and even a magnificent buck with a full rack of antlers were all positioned as if they were attending some kind of outdoor meeting. At the center of this impossible gathering was the bear cub from the night before, looking healthy and completely at ease among the other animals. When it spotted Xavier at the window, it stood up on its hind legs and made a gesture that looked remarkably like a wave. Xavier rubbed his eyes, certain that he must be hallucinating, but when he looked again, the scene remained exactly the same. The animals weren't fighting. They weren't showing any signs of the territorial behavior that should have made such a gathering impossible. Instead, they all seemed to be waiting for something. That something became clear when Raven appeared in the doorway behind him, still in her pajamas, her hair tousled from sleep. "Good morning, forest friends," she said in her small, clear voice, and every single animal in the backyard turned toward the sound. The response was immediate and extraordinary. The bird chorus grew louder and more complex, incorporating new melodies that seemed to be directed specifically at Raven. The animals on the ground began to move in patterns that looked almost like a dance, weaving between each other in intricate formations that created beautiful, temporary designs on the grass. Xavier watched in stunned silence as his 19-month-old daughter walked to the back door and opened it without any help. She should have needed assistance with the heavy door handle, but it turned easily in her small hands, as if it had been loosened specifically for her use. Raven stepped onto the back porch, and the moment her bare feet touched the wooden deck, something magical happened. Every flower in Celeste's carefully tended garden began to bloom simultaneously, even though it was still winter and most of the plants should have been dormant for months. The roses that had been pruned back to bare stems suddenly burst into full flower. The tulip bulbs that weren't supposed to emerge until spring pushed through the frozen ground and opened into perfect, colorful blossoms. Even the old apple tree at the edge of their property, which hadn't produced fruit in years, began to sprout tiny white flowers along its bare branches. "Raven, come back inside," Xavier called, his voice tight with worry. "It's too cold for you to be outside without shoes and a coat." But as he spoke, he realized that the morning air felt different. The bitter cold of the previous night had been replaced by a gentle warmth that seemed to emanate from wherever Raven walked. The grass beneath her feet remained green and unfrozen, creating a path of spring in the middle of winter. Raven looked back at her father and smiled. "It's not cold, Daddy. The forest friends keep me warm." As if to prove her point, several of the larger animals moved closer to where she stood, creating a living windbreak that shielded her from any breeze. The deer positioned themselves on one side, the coyote and fox on another, and the bear cub came to stand directly behind her, its warm fur acting like a natural coat. Xavier knew he should be terrified by the sight of his toddler surrounded by wild animals, but instead he felt a strange sense of peace. Every instinct told him that Raven was not in danger, that these creatures would protect her with their lives if necessary. "Xavier, what's happening out there?" Celeste's voice came from behind him, thick with sleep and confusion. "I can hear singing, and it sounds like—" Her words trailed off as she joined him at the window and saw the incredible scene in their backyard. For a long moment she simply stared, trying to process what she was witnessing. "She's talking to them," Celeste whispered finally. "Our baby is actually talking to wild animals and they're responding." Indeed, Raven was having what appeared to be a complex conversation with the assembled creatures. She would make sounds, some that resembled words, others that were more like the calls and songs of the animals themselves. And the various species would respond in turn, as if they were answering her questions or adding their own comments to the discussion. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, with different animals taking turns to speak, while the others listened quietly. Xavier noticed that there seemed to be a protocol to their communication, a structure that suggested this wasn't random noise but an organized exchange of information. Finally, Raven said something that caused all the animals to become very still and attentive. Then, one by one, they began to approach her. Each animal would come close enough to gently touch her with their nose, paw, or beak before stepping back to rejoin the group. It was clearly some kind of farewell ritual, and when it was complete, the animals began to disperse. But they didn't leave randomly or in panic, as wild animals typically would when humans were present. Instead, they departed in an orderly fashion, with the smaller creatures leaving first and the larger ones bringing up the rear, as if they were following some predetermined plan. The bear cub was the last to leave. It approached Raven one final time and very gently placed something at her feet before touching its nose to her hand. Then it turned and loped away toward the forest, disappearing into the trees just as the normal sounds of a waking neighborhood began to fill the air. Xavier and Celeste rushed outside to collect their daughter, who seemed completely unaware that anything unusual had occurred. At her feet lay the gift the bear cub had left, a single perfect white stone that seemed to glow with an inner light. "The cub says his mama wants to meet you and Daddy," Raven announced as her parents wrapped her in warm coats and boots. "She has something important to tell you about me." Before either parent could respond to this startling statement, their phone began to ring. Xavier glanced at his watch and frowned. It was barely 6 in the morning, far too early for social calls or even most emergencies. The caller was Dr. Patricia Fleming from the Wildlife Sanctuary, and her voice was filled with barely contained excitement. "Xavier, you need to get down here immediately," she said without preamble. "Something extraordinary is happening, and I think it's connected to what you told me about your daughter last night." "Patricia, it's 6 in the morning. What could be so urgent?" "We've had over 50 animals show up at the sanctuary since dawn," Dr. Fleming replied. "Not injured animals seeking help, but healthy wildlife that seems to be delivering things. They're bringing us items we need for our rehabilitation work, specific medicines, particular foods, even tools that we've been unable to locate for weeks." Xavier felt that familiar chill of the impossible running down his spine. "What kind of tools?" "A rare botanical identification guide that we lost months ago. A specialized feeding tube for injured birds that we ordered but never received. Even a set of surgical instruments that were stolen from our clinic last month. Xavier, these animals are returning stolen property and providing supplies as if they know exactly what we need. That's impossible, Patricia. I know it's impossible, but it's happening. And here's the truly strange part. Every single animal that's brought us something has done the same thing the bears did last night. They've all touched your name on our emergency contact list. It's like they're specifically requesting your involvement." Xavier looked at Raven, who was now sitting on their porch steps, drawing pictures in a notebook with crayons. Her latest artwork showed what appeared to be a building surrounded by animals, with stick figures that could represent people standing among them. "Patricia, I think you need to know that the situation with my daughter is more complex than I explained last night. Can we meet this morning? I think it would be better to discuss this in person." "Actually, Xavier, that's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Can you bring Raven with you? I have a theory about what's happening here, but I need to observe her interactions with our animals to confirm it." After making arrangements to meet Dr. Fleming at the sanctuary later that morning, Xavier hung up the phone and found Celeste studying their daughter with new eyes. "She's not just communicating with them," Celeste said quietly. "She's organizing them. Did you see how they responded to her this morning? It wasn't just random animal behavior. They were following her directions." Xavier nodded grimly. "I think our daughter might have some kind of gift that goes far beyond what we witnessed last night. And I think the animal community in this entire region is responding to her presence." As if to confirm his suspicions, Raven looked up from her drawing and made an announcement that sent chills through both parents. "The forest animals want to help people who take care of hurt animals," she said with the matter-of-fact tone that small children use to discuss the most extraordinary things. "They've been watching the sanctuary for a long time, And they know Dr. Fleming is good. They want to work together. Raven, sweetheart, Celeste asked gently, how do you know about Dr. Fleming and the sanctuary? Raven pointed toward the forest that surrounded their property. The animals told me. They tell me lots of things. They say there are people who hurt animals and people who help animals, and I need to learn the difference so I can protect everyone. The implications of her words hit both parents simultaneously. Their 19-month-old daughter wasn't just communicating with local wildlife. She was apparently receiving information about the broader human community from an entire network of animals that had been observing and reporting on human behavior. Before they could fully process this revelation, another unusual event occurred that would add yet another layer to the mystery surrounding their daughter. A vehicle pulled into their driveway. Not Dr. Fleming's familiar truck, but a large official-looking van with government plates and the logo of the Department of Natural Resources on its side. Two people got out of the van, a middle-aged woman in a park ranger uniform and a younger man carrying what appeared to be scientific equipment. They approached the house with the purposeful stride of officials conducting an investigation. The woman introduced herself as Ranger Sarah Martinez and her companion as Dr. James Chen, a wildlife behaviorist from the State University. They explained that they had received multiple reports of unusual animal activity in the area and were conducting a routine investigation. We've had calls from residents all around the lake, Ranger Martinez explained. People are reporting organized animal gatherings, unusual migration patterns, and behavior that doesn't match any documented wildlife activities in this region. Xavier and Celeste exchanged glances, both wondering how much they should reveal about their daughter's apparent abilities. Have you noticed anything unusual around your property? Dr. Chen asked, setting up what looked like audio recording equipment. Any changes in animal behavior or unexpected wildlife encounters? Before Xavier could answer, Raven solved the problem of disclosure in the most direct way possible. She walked up to Dr. Chen, looked at his recording equipment with obvious interest, and said something that made both officials stare at her in amazement. Are you trying to record the animal songs? You need to use different settings. The frequency range is wrong for forest conversations. Dr. Chen knelt down to Raven's eye level, his expression shifting from casual interest to intense focus. How do you know about frequency ranges, sweetheart? The animals taught me, Raven replied simply. They say human machines don't hear all the sounds they make, but I can teach you how to listen better. What happened next would change the course of the investigation, and ultimately the course of all their lives. Raven walked over to Dr. Chen's equipment and, with the confidence of someone who understood exactly what she was doing, began to adjust the settings. Her small fingers moved over the controls with precision that should have been impossible for someone her age, and within moments the speakers began to emit sounds that none of the adults had noticed before. The air around them was filled with complex animal communications, calls, songs, and patterns of sound that revealed an active, ongoing conversation between dozens of different species. "My God," Dr. Chen whispered, staring at the audio readings on his equipment. "This is the most sophisticated animal communication network I've ever recorded. It's like they're operating some kind of organized information system." Ranger Martinez was looking at Raven with an expression of wonder and growing concern. "Dr. Marshall, I think we need to have a very detailed conversation about your daughter and what's been happening in this area." As the four adults began to discuss the extraordinary situation, none of them noticed that the forest around their property had grown very quiet. The usual sounds of wildlife had stopped completely, as if every animal in the area was holding its breath, waiting to see how the humans would respond to the revelation of their secret world. High in the trees surrounding the Marshall family's home, dozens of pairs of eyes watched the proceedings with keen interest. The animal community that had embraced Raven as one of their own was now observing these new humans, trying to determine whether they were friends or threats to the remarkable child who had become their bridge between two worlds. What none of them knew was that this meeting would set in motion a series of events that would eventually lead to a discovery so extraordinary, so unprecedented, that it would challenge everything science thought it knew about the relationship between humans and the natural world. The moment stretched on in tense silence as the government officials processed what they had witnessed. Dr. Chen's equipment continued to reveal the intricate web of animal communication surrounding them, while Ranger Martinez struggled to reconcile her training with the impossible reality of a toddler who seemed to be the central figure in a vast wildlife network. But it was Raven herself who broke the silence in a way that would forever change how everyone present understood the true nature of her gift. "They're scared," she said quietly, looking up at the adults with eyes that seemed far older than her 19 months. "The animals are scared because they think you might try to take me away from them." As if summoned by her words, the forest around them began to come alive. Not with the chaotic sounds of frightened wildlife, but with a coordinated response that demonstrated the true scope of what they were dealing with. The bear cub appeared first, emerging from the tree line with its mother close behind. Then came the deer family, the foxes, the raccoons, and dozens of other creatures that had been watching from the shadows. But these weren't the only animals responding to Raven's distress. From the lake came a family of beavers who had never been seen on land in daylight. From the sky descended hawks, eagles, and owls that typically avoided human contact. Even from the distant mountains came the haunting calls of wolves, their voices carrying across the valley in harmonies that spoke of ancient bonds and protective instincts. Dr. Chen's equipment was registering sound patterns that defied everything he knew about animal behavior. The creatures weren't just gathering randomly, they were positioning themselves in a defensive formation around Raven, creating a living barrier between the child and the government officials. "This is incredible," he whispered, his scientific excitement warring with a growing sense of awe. "It's like they're operating as a single organism, a collective intelligence that's been activated by perceived threat to the child." Ranger Martinez had her hand on her radio, but she hesitated to call for backup. The animals weren't showing aggression toward the humans. They were simply making it clear that they would not allow Raven to be separated from them. It was Xavier who finally understood what needed to happen. As a doctor, he had learned to recognize when a situation required not intervention, but acceptance of something beyond normal medical understanding. "Raven," he said gently, kneeling down to his daughter's level. "Can you tell your friends that we're not going to take you away from them? Can you explain that, Doctor? Chen and Ranger Martinez just want to understand." Raven nodded and began to make the complex sounds that her parents had learned to recognize as her communication with the animals. But this time, her vocalizations were different, deeper, more resonant, carrying across the landscape with a power that seemed impossible from such a small voice. The response was immediate and breathtaking. Every animal present began to vocalize in return, creating a symphony of sound that seemed to encompass not just their immediate area, but the entire forest. The calls were picked up and carried by creatures miles away, spreading outward in concentric circles until the entire valley was filled with the music of the wild. Dr. Chen watched his equipment in amazement as it registered communication frequencies that shouldn't have been possible, patterns of sound that suggested a level of organization and intelligence that science had never documented in wildlife Po. "They're not just animals," he breathed, staring at the readings. This is evidence of a collective consciousness, a shared intelligence that spans multiple species across an entire ecosystem. As the animal chorus reached its crescendo, something extraordinary began to happen that would remain etched in the memory of everyone present for the rest of their lives. The very air around Raven began to shimmer, as if the intensity of the animal's communication was creating some kind of visible energy field. The shimmer grew stronger, pulsing in rhythm with the calls and songs of the creatures, until it became clear that they were witnessing something that transcended the normal boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. Within that shimmer, images began to form, visions that showed the true history of the relationship between Raven and the animal kingdom. They saw her first night by the lake, but from the animal's perspective, witnessed the moment when every creature in the forest recognized her as something special, something sacred. They saw the vast network of animal intelligence that stretched across continents, an ancient system of communication and cooperation that humans had never suspected existed. They saw how this network had been waiting, watching, hoping for someone who could serve as a bridge between their world and the human world. And they saw Raven's future, glimpses of the woman she would become, working alongside both humans and animals to heal the growing divide between civilization and nature, bringing understanding where there had been fear, cooperation where there had been conflict. As the visions faded and the shimmer dissipated, the animal chorus gradually grew quieter, until finally the forest returned to its normal sounds. But nothing would ever be normal again for any of the humans who had witnessed this revelation. Dr. Chen was the first to speak, his voice filled with wonder. This isn't just about one child with an unusual gift. This is about the evolution of consciousness itself, about the next step in the relationship between humanity and the natural world. Ranger Martinez nodded slowly, her official protocols forgotten in the face of something far greater than any government regulation could address. "We need to protect this," she said quietly. "Not just Raven, but the entire network she's connected to. This could change everything." Xavier and Celeste held their daughter close, finally understanding that their role as parents would involve not just raising a child, but nurturing a bridge between worlds that could heal centuries of damage between humans and nature. As the government officials packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, they made a promise that would shape the future of wildlife conservation and animal research. Instead of treating Raven as a subject to be studied or controlled, they would work to protect and support her unique abilities, creating a new framework for human-animal cooperation that honored the intelligence and wisdom of both species. The bear cub was the last to approach before the gathering dispersed. It walked up to Raven one final time and gently placed its paw over her heart, a gesture that spoke of bonds that would never be broken regardless of time or distance. "We'll always be connected," Raven whispered to her first wild friend. "No matter where life takes us, the forest will always be our home." As the sun set over the lake that evening, the Marshall family stood together on their porch, watching the lights begin to twinkle in houses across the valley. But they also noticed something else, points of light moving through the forest that weren't electric bulbs or flashlights. These were the eyes of the animals who had chosen to remain nearby, the guardians who would watch over Raven as she grew, ensuring that the bridge between worlds would be protected and strengthened with each passing day. Years later, when Raven had grown into a young woman whose work with wildlife had revolutionized conservation efforts around the world, she would often return to this lake, to the floating platform where her extraordinary journey had begun. And every time she visited, the bear family would be there waiting for her. The cub, now grown into a magnificent adult, its mother still protective and proud, and new generations of cubs who had heard the stories of the little human girl who had changed everything. The platform itself had become a symbol of hope, a place where researchers, conservationists, and ordinary people came to witness the ongoing miracle of communication between species. But for Raven, it would always be simply the place where she learned that love transcends all boundaries, where a frightened bear cub and a determined toddler proved that the connections between living beings run deeper than fear, stronger than difference, and more powerful than anything that tries to divide the inhabitants of this beautiful, wild world.